Hey everyone, my name is Alejandro Ortiz. I'm going to be doing the New Historicism lens and analyzing Hamlet and 1984. So, just for a quick overview, New Historicism is an analytic lens that is used in literature as a way to break down and interpret different texts based on historical influences. It analyzes what historical events were going on at the time, or what events the author may have experienced in their lifetime, and how those would affect how and what they wrote. The first story we're going to be going over is Hamlet, and the first event is going to be Catholics versus Protestants. Just for some basic context, after a combination of the Protestant Reformation, King Henry VIII's decision to have England remove itself from the Roman Catholic Church and make the monarchs the head of state, the religious state of England and the war between the Catholics and Protestants were constantly swaying. During the reign of King Henry VIII, Protestantism was the leading religion in England, and continued to be into the reign of Henry's son, King Edward VI. However, after his death, Queen Mary I was instated and began to sway the country back into the direction of Catholicism. She began to reinstate parts of the Catholic Church, burn Protestant books, and introduce hearsay as both a state and spiritual crime equivalent to treason. Finally, within the rule of Queen Elizabeth, Protestants were brought back to the center stage, becoming the ruling religion once more. However, their religion was more accepted as long as certain laws were followed. This allowed for more acceptance of Catholicism, but still left them in an awkward position as they weren't allowed to be completely open with their religion, even though they could still practice in private. These complicated times even affected the likes of Shakespeare, as many of his works incorporated some form of comparison between the Catholics and Protestant views. Throughout Hamlet, the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism can be seen through the different views of the ghost of Hamlet's father, King Hamlet. Shakespeare used these varying opinions as a way to both appease and explore both sides of the argument, examining how each religion treats ghosts and ideas of the supernatural. On one side was the Catholic point of view, the belief that ghosts come back to right a wrong and spend time in purgatory repenting for their sins. On the other side, there was the Protestant point of view, and their idea that ghosts are demons from hell who were sent to trick and pull people further from God. In the play, these ideas clash as many characters do not know how to interpret the ghost and whether its intentions are genuine or not. Many characters, including Horatio, warn Hamlet of the possible dangers of the ghost, representing the Protestants of society, while Hamlet and his father's ghost represent the Catholic point of view. Another example of the two religions clashing is in the representation of grief and how each religion mourns their dead. After the death of King Hamlet, a funeral is held where the differences between Catholic and Protestant traditions are compared. During the 1996 movie Hamlet, during the funeral scene, Hamlet represents the Catholic tradition as at the funeral he is dressed in all black, as well as being very sad and taking long amounts of time to mourn. This aligns with Catholic traditions, and in comparison, Claudius and other attendants of King Hamlet's funeral represent the Protestant traditions. They use the funeral as a time to celebrate the dead, wearing brighter colors and having less mourning in comparison to Catholics. The first quote we're going to be looking at is, "Angels and ministers of grace defend us. Be thou a spirit of health or a goblin damned. Bring with thee airs from heaven or blast from hell. Be thy intent wicked or charitable. Thou comest in such questionable shape." This quote is said by Hamlet when he first encounters his father's ghost, and is both an expression of the Catholic and Protestant point of views. One side of Hamlet believes this to be a treacherous demon, while the other believes this to be a kind spirit. This indecisive argument Hamlet has with himself is a representation of the current religious state of England and the swaying influence. The second quote is, "Good Hamlet, cast thy nighted colour off, and let thine eyes shine, look like a friend on Denmark. Do not forever with thy veiled lids seek for thy noble father in the dust. Thou knowest 'tis common, all that lives must die. Passing through nature to eternity, ay, madam, it is common. If it be, why it seems so particular with thee? Seems, madam, nay, it is. I know not seems." This quote is a conversation between Hamlet and Gertrude and shows the difference in how each religion expresses their grief. Hamlet's mother, Gertrude, represents the Protestants and their traditions. They do not grieve for as long and prefer to celebrate life than mourn it, while Hamlet represents Catholics with their long-term grief and the mourning of their dead. The next thing we're going to be talking about is the next monarch. During her reign, Queen Elizabeth was known as a virgin queen and was known for being married to her country. Thus, as Elizabeth began to get older, many citizens began to worry as to when she would have an heir or name an heir to the throne. This worry began to grow as time passed, as many became anxious of the possibility that a foreign power may take advantage of the country's lack of leadership. During the creation of Hamlet, this unease was at an all-time high. Thus, during the creation of Hamlet, Shakespeare decided to base parts of the plot off of the current political state of England, as a way to raise awareness and explore possible outcomes. In Hamlet, to represent the people's worry of a foreign power, Shakespeare created the character of Fortinbras. Fortinbras was the personification of the people's worry, and throughout the play sought to take over the kingdom of Denmark. In addition, during the final act of the play, after the dust settles, Shakespeare decides to make his own prediction as to how Queen Elizabeth would name her heir. In the play, after Hamlet successfully kills Claudius and becomes king, he realizes he will shortly die as he had been inflicted with poison. Thus, to not leave his kingdom leaderless, he decides to name the heir to his throne on his deathbed. Ironically, Shakespeare's prediction would be much more accurate than anticipated, as 2 years later, on her deathbed, Queen Elizabeth I would name the heir to her throne her cousin James VI. The third quote we're going to be looking at is, "Now, sir, young Fortinbras, of unimproved metal, hot and full, hath in the skirts of Norway here and there struck of a list of lawless resolutes, for food and diet to some enterprise, that hath a stomach in't which is no other, as it does well appear unto our state, but to recover of us by strong hand, in terms compulsatory those forced lands. So by his father lost, and this I take it is the main motive of our preparations." This quote is during the first act and scene of Hamlet, in which Horatio explains to Bernardo and Marcellus the current rumor of why Denmark has been in such a rush developing its defenses. They believe that Fortinbras is planning on coming and taking land that his father lost. This worry is a representation of the people of England and the anxiety they had about the possible foreign powers coming to take over, as Queen Elizabeth had still not named an heir. Finally, for Hamlet, we're going to be talking about death and grief. Hamlet is a tragedy, a play filled with the death of loved ones and the grief of those lost. Hamlet losing his father, his love, and being forced to betray his childhood friends, while simultaneously dealing with the fact that his father's murderer is his uncle. Hamlet is sent into depression after learning of his father's murder, then directs his grief to revenge of his father, slowly losing himself in the process. Ophelia lost her father, in the love of her life, the grief driving her to insanity, and Laertes lost his sister and father, filling him full of anger and leading him down the path of revenge. Throughout the play, many characters experience unfortunate losses and are forced to deal with the grief of their losses. Shakespeare uses this to explore the different ways people experience and handle grief. Around 4 years prior to the creation of Hamlet, Shakespeare himself experienced a terrible loss, the loss of his son Hamlet. Hamlet unfortunately died in 1596 at the age of 11, and this death had a massive effect on Shakespeare, as any parent knows the death of a child at such a young age is a horrific pain. This death thus heavily impacted the writings of many of Shakespeare's plays, including Hamlet, having a very similar name to his son Hamlet. Shakespeare's sadness began to infect his writing, and his loss and grief became key parts of his writing, influencing how different characters act and react to different situations. The final quote we'll be looking at is, "Seems, madam? Nay, it is. I know not seems. 'Tis not alone my inky cloak, good mother, nor customary suits of solemn black, nor windy suspirations of forced breath, nor the fruitful river in the eye, nor the dejected behaviours of the visage, together with all forms, mood, shapes of grief, that can denote me truly." This quote is at King Hamlet's funeral, in which Hamlet describes the depression and grief that he has in his heart for his father's death. This connects to Shakespeare and the death of his son Hamlet, and the grief he must have felt when he lost his son. Next, we will be looking at 1984, and the first event we'll be talking about is the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War was a horrific war between the Spanish nationalists, created by Francisco Franco, and the Spanish Republic, fought over the political instability of the recently created Republic government of Spain and the conservatives. The Nationals was a conservative group composed of the monarchy, the Catholic Church, and fascist groups, supported by fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Their goal was to restore Spain to its previous form and conserve the traditions of Spain. The Republic was a left-wing group that was fighting to support the recently elected Democratic Republic. They were supported by communist republics, the Soviet Union, and even other volunteer fighters from other countries. During the Civil War, George Orwell decided to volunteer to fight and support the Republicans during the war. Orwell was a frontline soldier who fought in Catalonia and the Aragon Front for around 6 months and was injured on the battlefield. During Orwell's time fighting in the Spanish Civil War, he observed the way power could be used against people and the way organizations will do anything to stay on top. He witnessed his friend and commander be arrested, interrogated, and tortured by the other Republican groups. His room he was staying in with his wife was raided and searched, with soldiers closely analyzing Orwell's writing, attempting to find evidence of conspiracy against the Republic. Orwell was also subjected to a lot of propaganda. A poster Orwell specifically remembers is the Terror the Mask poster, which depicted a mask bearing the hammer and sickle being ripped off to reveal a snarling swastika tattoo maniac, allegedly the true face of the POUM, the Republican group that Orwell was a part of. It was seeing this and seeing the different agents from Stalin's Secret Service that enlightened Orwell to the corruption of governments. All of this experience thus heavily influenced the writing of 1984 and the representation of the government in the propaganda scene in the book. The quote to analyze, or the quote to look at, is, "On each landing, opposite the lift shaft, the poster with enormous gaze from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you," the caption beneath it ran. This quote is a connection to the propaganda that George Orwell saw firsthand during his time serving in the Spanish Civil War. These propaganda posters represented the government and organizations manipulating the public to persuade them to their side. Orwell witnessed how widely they were used and how effective they truly are. Next, we'll be looking at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a very atrocious and dubious society that rained terror and pain upon its citizens. The Soviet Union, a communist society that existed through most of the 20th century, was created after the Russian Revolution in 1917, when the Bolsheviks, the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the Russian government led by the Tsars, and thus the USSR was formed, a Marxist communist state, and was a massive influence for Orwell and one of the main inspirations behind the government and society of Oceania. During Stalin's reign, Soviet citizens lived in a type of prison state, including being barred from leaving the country and suffering from widespread shortages of food and clothing and other goods. Stalin enacted the economic policies that killed millions of people from famine in the 1930s and kept Soviet citizens far poorer than their counterparts in Western nations. Stalin eliminated freedom of speech and executed or imprisoned millions of Soviet citizens during the Great Terror. This is eerily similar to what is seen of Oceania and how they treat their citizens. Even their authority figure's Big Brother has many similarities with Joseph Stalin. Another big similarity is the famous quote 2 plus 2 makes 5 in 1984, which is a representation of the party's manipulation, but also a real-life propaganda poster made by the Soviet Union stating that 2 plus 2 plus workers' enthusiasm is equivalent to 5. The Soviet Union and their government had a clear influence on the creation of Oceania and their policies, as well as how they used propaganda to turn people to their side. The quote to look at is, "You are a slow learner, Winston," said O'Brien gently. "How can I help it?" Winston blubbered. "How can I help seeing what is in front of my eyes? 2 and 2 are 4. Sometimes, Winston, sometimes they are 5, sometimes they are 3, sometimes they are all of them at once. You must try harder. It is not easy to become sane." This quote is a conversation between Winston and O'Brien in the Ministry of Love as Winston undergoes his brainwashing by the party. Throughout the book, there has been a famous quote, 2 plus 2 make 5. And during this conversation, O'Brien realized that this is not trying to create any fact, but to train the people to accept whatever the party says to them. This is similar to how propaganda was used for the Soviet Union, with it being used as a tool to convert people to one's cause and hold them under the government's influence. Finally, we'll be looking at World War II. As someone who lived throughout World War II, Orwell could comment and connect the living situations of London and the constant fear and terror that people were experiencing daily. This experience living in London throughout World War II and living through the rough conditions, the daily bombings, and the food rationing had a lot of influence on how Winston and the other characters in 1984 lived their lives. London during World War II was a very dangerous and harsh place to live in. London would experience massive amounts of bombing, and civilians would constantly have to run and find bomb shelters, even multiple times per day. Bombing was so horrible that children were sent off to the countryside to be safer and farther away from the danger. And another negative of life in London was rationing. During World War II, British supply boats were constantly sunk by German U-boats, and many valuable materials and food supplies were lost at sea. This caused the British population to have very strict and small diets, restricting the foods to the foods that could be grown and manufactured in the country or could be airlifted through the fighting. Finally, there were many blackouts that happened all throughout London during the war. Many times, electricity would be cut, streetlights would be blacked out, and the houses would be locked down. These techniques were used not only to save power and energy, but also to keep cities as dark as possible, as to avoid making them obvious targets for bombers. When comparing these real-life events to the descriptions in 1984, it is clear to see how Orwell's experience had an influence in the writing as characters went through very similar conditions. Citizens were constantly experiencing poverty, with many items being rations from chocolate to even razors, and citizens were constantly enduring random bombing, forced to endure the death and destruction, and finally, they had strict curfews and set times where lights were cut out across the entire city. Oceania's lifestyle is very similar to World War II London's, but the pain and suffering of the people is not only amplified by the enemy, but by their own government. The quote to look at for this is, "Everybody kept asking you for razor blades. Actually, he had 2 unused ones which he was holding up. There had been a famine of them for months past. At any given moment, there was some necessary article which the party shops were unable to supply. Sometimes it was buttons, sometimes it was darning wool, sometimes it was shoelaces. At present, it was razor blades. You could only get a hold of them, if at all, by scrounging more or less figuratively on the free market." This quote describes the rationing going on in Oceania, not only for food, but also for personal items. It seems that at any point in time, there's always something running low or in need. This is influenced by the rationing in London and how food, hygiene, and clothes were rationed because of the war going on around them. And the final quote to look at is, "The rocket bombs crashed oftener than ever, and sometimes in the far distance there were enormous explosions which no one could explain and about which there were wild rumors." This quote is when Winston was making an observation of the amount of destruction that was going on. He said that more bombs were being dropped every day, and there were more damage and casualties every day. This was also inspired by Orwell's time in London and his own experience dealing with bombs and bomb shelters. Thank you guys very much for analyzing Hamlet in 1984 with me through the historical lens. Hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you.